So the nice thing about all this stuff, it really should still say something like CTT and test items, and which this is still really based on and around classical test theory, and this idea of looking at tests and the items on a test to go beyond just sort of reliability and move into some other ideas about things like difficulty and discrimination of items. And it's a weird term, and every time I bring it up, I always feel like I got to do like a disclaimer or something. So the word discrimination gets a bad reputation, right? So to discriminate, it seems like a bad thing, but what it gets down to the root of the word, to tell the difference between, to be able to discriminate between people based on how they respond is actually a good thing. It's actually, you want your test to be discriminating. You want to be able to tell people who are high on depression for people who are low on depression and those kinds of things. So when we talk about discrimination or the discriminability of items, it's actually not what you think it is. It's not the connotation that it has typically. It's a positive thing for items to do. So any questions or anything you want to talk about before we get started on new stuff? Okay. All right, hearing no questions, I'll assume that everything's good. Move on. And we can hopefully have some time at the end if you guys, I can spend some time sort of after class if you want to stay on and talk about the test or something. We can do that too. You should all have your test back graded and everything. One of the probably most positive experiences I've had grading, in the sense of having just 5 tests to grade. That was kind of nice. All right, let's talk about stuff. So there are lots and lots of item formats, those that you'll be, very familiar with, and some you may never have seen before. There's lots of different ways of sort of getting at the root of some of these questions that we're trying to ask, personality tests and IQ and those kinds of things. So you've seen, the sort of dichotomous formats where there's 2 choices, or you're probably most seen in questions on a test that are either true, false. But there are a lot of things like the MMPI and other things where you're given 2 choices where either you agree or you don't. And so they like a lot of dichotomies, and there's some logic behind that, because the polytomous, or these sort of what they call polycotomous items, are where they have sort of more than 2 alternatives, sort of like your test where you had 4 choices and you pick them like a multiple choice test. For trying to assess things like knowledge and stuff, having more than 2 choices makes sense. But if you're looking at something like agreement or someone's belief in something, giving them more choices sometimes can actually dilute things some, and then people would tend to want to sit on the fence. So if you have a 5 choice item that goes from disagree to agree in 5 choices, you get a lot of people that'll be like, well, I don't know, I'm gonna pick 3. They want to sort of fit themselves right in the middle, because they're not really sure how they feel about things. So dichotomous items don't let you do that. You have to choose one side or the other, and you can't just sit on the fence. It sort of forces you. It's a forced choice sort of situation. So you got dichotomous and these sort of polytomous items, and this sort of also goes in some ways for the Likert style items that I just mentioned, the disagree, strongly disagree, the strongly agree, and 5 or 7 or some choices like that. And one of the things that are interesting that again you'll see, or you did see on the midterm, is that when you have multiple choice items, the harder the question is, oftentimes depends on how good the distractors are. If you're looking at 4 choices on a multiple choice, and only one of them even makes remote sense, and the other 3 choices don't even fit the question, then even if you don't really know the answer, you can deduce what the answer is. So the distractors can become either something that is on your side, or it can work against you, because if every answer seems like a viable answer, then it becomes more tricky, more difficult. And people actually will oftentimes assess the distractors, because if people are constantly putting the wrong answer, sort of look at why is that one distractor seems so appealing to people. So one type of format, like multiple choice items, is you have incorrect choices on some kind of test, and you have to you should have 3 or 4 distractors if you're going to use them. And one study figured out that, that the reliability for a test with 2 distractors versus 4 or whatever didn't really seem to make much difference. You seem to have, if you're going to use distractors, you should have at least a few. And so the best is to have somewhere between 2 and 4. But, of course, there needs to be further study to figure that stuff out, because it probably depends on the area and the topic and other things. So, like on your exam, there are 4 choices, 1 correct answer, and 3 distractors. So that's what they call those, incorrect, but sometimes too appealing. And then it comes down to, should you guess on a test? So some tests, like I do not do this, but some tests will actually penalize you for picking the wrong answer. So not only do you not get the question correct, but you'll lose additional points or some portion of points for answering it incorrect. And they do this a lot on aptitude tests. It's to encourage students not to guess, right? Because you can go through and just guess, and if it's 4 choices, you'd like to get 25% of the test correct just by guessing. So there's a correction for guessing. I think it's like on the SBAC or STAR or whatever the achievement testing stuff that goes on in high schools and junior high schools. I want to say it's something like, for every answer you get incorrect, not only do you not get credit for the question, but you also lose an additional 0.25 of a point. So for every 4 wrong answers you get, you lose an additional point beyond the points you don't get for answering it correct. So should you guess on them? It depends if there is correction for guessing or not. You can actually, this idea of a sort of corrected score is, R is the number you got correct, and then W is the number incorrect divided by the number of choices. So usually the reason why it's like 0.25 correction for guessing is because there's 4 choices. So they're basically penalizing you for the chance, the probability of just guessing at the right answer. So if there's 4 choices, then you lose 0.25 because that's the probability of guessing. So if there's no correction for guessing, then it actually makes sense to guess, because again, you can for every 4 questions you answer or you guess at, it's like you're going to get one of them correct and actually increase your score. But if there's no correction for if there is a correction for guessing, it's actually better to leave them blank than it is to guess at the answer, unless you can narrow it down. So even if you don't know the answer and there's 4 choices, but say one of them is definitely not the right answer, then it actually, you might want to guess. But if you can narrow it down to just 2, it's like, you got like a 50-50 chance of getting it correct, then it might actually be worth sort of guessing at it. But if you're just straight guessing, have no clue, and there's a correction for guessing, it's probably you're gonna get penalized for it. That makes sense? So, like if you say it's a 20 item test and you got 15 items correct, and you guessed at 5 of them, so 5 divided by 4 is going to be then the correction. Okay, so you're going to lose an additional 1.25 points for guessing. Questions about that? Do you ever remember? Oh, I'm sorry. So you're always going to lose a point for incorrect. I mean, you're always not going to get the point. This is actually, you're going to get, you're going to take away 1/4 of a point from other answers that you got correct. That's the part that sort of makes it like almost mean, right? So you guess at a question, and because it has 4 choices, you lose 0.25 from the points you already earned on other questions you got correct. So, I mean, if you don't get a question correct, that's already you're already losing 1 point. But if there's a correction for guessing, you're going to end up losing 1.25 points as opposed to just 1 that you normally would if there's no correction. So what I'm saying down here is, if there's correction for guessing, you probably shouldn't guess. And then it says, unless you can sort of beat the odds, meaning that unless you can narrow it down enough so that it's between 1 or 2 choices, then guessing actually might be beneficial. But if you don't know anything and you have really 4 choices and you're picking randomly between the 4 choices, it's actually better to leave it blank. Yeah, yeah. So let's say we can, they do this a lot on sort of aptitude or achievement tests. So in, I don't know if anyone remember taking, like, if you lived somewhere around here, at least in California, it used to be called STAR. I think now it's called the SBAC. I forget what it stands for, but they were the standardized testing that they did all through, like, the grade school all the way, I think, through 11th grade, and it tests things like math and reading and all that kind of stuff. And they use that as a way of sort of deciding things like funding and stuff for schools. If a school in general is sort of below a certain cutoff for these standardized testing, that can actually greatly impact them. Oftentimes we'll see on the front of, if you drive by elementary school or junior high school or something, on their board it'll say, like, there's like scrolling light board things. They'll have, like, their school score for something like the SBAC. The SBAC stands for Smarter Balanced, Achievement something, Smarter Balanced. Man, I should know and I don't. But so let's say there are 100 questions. Okay, so there's 100 questions total. You answer 50 of them correctly. Okay. You guess at another 25. Right, so this is the correct answers. So right away you should have, out of 100 points, you have a score of 50. Okay, but you guess at another, 25 of them, and then you leave another 25 blank because you don't know the answer and you don't want to guess. Okay, so that's 25. So you should have a score of 50. What happens based on this, if they're correct for guessing, is they're going to take your score of 50, they're going to subtract from that the number that you guessed at incorrectly, and they're going to divide that by the number of choices. So this N's a little bit misleading. It's not N for people, it's N for choices. It really could be K or some other letter. But they're going to take the number of choices, which, so let's say there's 4 choices in each question, and they're going to take that minus 1. So I don't know why it's minus 1. Let's say it's 5 choices. That makes it a little easier. 5 choices, so 5 choices minus 1. So you have, it's 4. You're cutting everything into fourths. So this part is the correction for guessing. So you're taking your score of 25, or sorry, your score of 50, and you're going to lose an additional, 25 divided by 4. Come on. The main thing is if you answer a question incorrectly, they assume that's guessing. So you actually get penalized for. So not only do you not get the point, right? You do not earn a point for that question. You lose an additional portion of a point because you got it wrong. Yeah. So if you guess and get it correct, then they don't know the difference between you guessing at it and knowing the answer. It's if you answer a question incorrectly, they assume you guessed at it, and you lose points for that. So you actually get an additional penalty for answering incorrectly. So 25 minus 5 is just like 6. Yeah, I just had on my screen. It was 6 point. So this is going to be 50 minus an additional 6.25. So in the end, you're going to end up having a 43.75 or something like that. It's going to be your actual score because of those 25 that you guessed at and got incorrect. That's funny. I was just. I don't know if you heard me. I'm like, n-1. Why is it n-1? I think because one of them is actually the correct answer. So they're dividing not by the the total number of choices, but by the number of distractors. So if n is the total number of choices, like 5, for instance, then 5 minus 1 tells you there are 4 distractors. So if you picked one of those distractors, you lose 0.25 points. You don't see this a lot in, like, you know, college classroom tests. I don't know anybody does that, but the whole point behind this is it's supposed to not prevent you, but to discourage you from guessing at questions, just randomly guess at stuff. That it's better if you don't know an answer, leave it blank. Just to indicate that you don't know what the answer is. You don't lose the additional points, because notice none of these that you left blank, these are not being counted against you. You're not losing additional points, you just don't get those points. So instead of losing, you know, you lose 25 points off your total, but you would lose 26.25 if you had guessed at those. Not 26, 31.25 if you had guessed at those questions. Right. So do none of you remember taking any tests that had corrections for guessing where you were told, like, not to guess? Yeah, the stuff that, like, every other year in, like, grade, like, K through 12, you would take everyone in the school. Like, the school basically was shut down for, like, a couple days, and all you would do is do these testings. And then even for the week beforehand, usually you were doing, like, practice runs and all kinds of stuff, because your score, your individual score, got aggregated to the school's sort of score, and that actually then would... I forgot, man, I can't, it's like API score? No, whatever it is. They use it to sort of score the schools. Schools that do well, then, you know, get sort of special treatment or whatever, get funding for things or whatever. And the schools that don't do well, so usually get reprimanded and issues. It also gets used to lure parents to bring their kids to those schools if it's a school that does lotteries or other things. So if you're a school that has a high score, parents are more likely to want to take their kids to that school. And so it's all kinds of political things that go on with those. It's supposed to indicate, you know, all kinds of stuff, and they've used it more and more to try to, you know, identify kids who are sort of below proficiency on these things, and they get extra sort of after-school interventions and all kinds of stuff. But it is based on this idea that if you guess, you actually do lose. For every 4 questions you guess, you lose an additional point. And that point comes off the points you actually already earned by answering questions correct. Because you would have had a 50. If you left all the other 50 blank, you'd have a score of 50. But because you guessed a 25, you lose an additional 6.25 points. I think it has to do with a couple things. One, if a student doesn't know something, right, if they don't know it, I think they want them to indicate that they don't know by leaving it blank, meaning that, like, it was never taught to them, or it was just something that is missing in their education. If they guess at it, then it's like, all right, did the kid just answer it incorrectly, or was material not covered? I think it was supposed to. It's supposed to be another way in which they're testing the kids' decision making processes, right? If I don't know an answer, do I know well enough to leave it alone than to try to guess at it, or can I narrow it down and sort of guess at it, make an educated guess, and actually increase my odds of getting the question correct, even if I'm just guessing at it? So it's supposed to be just sort of increasing students' sort of testing strategy. I don't know. I don't think the SATs or those kind of things actually do that. They might, but I don't know that they do. Usually it's not scored in that way. It's scored based on percentiles and sort of it's more norm reference than it is criterion reference, like the aptitude tests are. Anyway, I thought it's interesting. If you didn't know that before, it's kind of an interesting idea that this correction for guessing actually can change the way in which you respond to test items. If you know that there's no correction, then guessing is totally a viable sort of thing to do. You should guess at everything. And I usually tell students on exams and stuff, like, don't leave questions blank. Why would you do that? You got 4 choices or something, and it gives you a 25% chance of just picking the right answer. Don't leave anything blank. But if there is a penalty for it, then you may want to leave it blank. And now you're left with a more complicated decision process about should you answer the question or leave it blank or try to guess or. All right. Then there's this ever present in social sciences, the sort of Likert rating scale. Now, most people say Likert. I remember the first time I was taking a research method class or something like that. I asked a question about Likert scales, and the teacher sort of chuckled and was like, "It's not Likert, it's Likert." And he sort of made a point of almost sort of making fun of the fact that I had mispronounced the word. Well, come to find out, the guy's name actually was Likert, not Likert. But everyone's so weirded out by the sound of it, Likert scale, that everyone, I guess, at some point decided to change how it's pronounced and pronounce it Likert. I forgot the person's first name, but it's the last name. The person who sort of designed or first sort of developed these kinds of questions, these rating scales, their last name was Likert. I even think, go ahead. I could be wrong, but I almost think that his name was originally Likert, like literally Likert. But again, it's been sort of changed because of people's sort of weirdness around the sound of the word. That has the word lick in it or something, and it just makes it weird. But with that bit aside, and I don't know that's 100% factual about the Likert thing, but I think I have a vague memory of that somewhere. As a field, and in social sciences in general, probably wouldn't be a field the way we are if we didn't come, from these sort of types of scales, because we use these all the time. We ask people to, it'll be some kind of statement or something, and then you'll be asked whether you strongly disagree to strongly agree. Now notice here I've used 6 statements. The nice thing about 6 statements, it depends on how you want to go about it. 6 statements forces people to choose. So you have to be on one side, either slightly into disagree or slightly into agree. If you use an odd number, then usually the middle of the odd numbering is something like neutral. So if you want people to be able to indicate that they don't have a preference or don't have a side, then use an odd number and you allow them to sort of choose neutral. If not, you use an even number like this and sort of force them one side or the other. And what's funny is, going back to what I was saying about dichotomous items before, this whole thing could just be, either this is basically just on the disagree side, right? And then down here, these statements are in the sort of agreement side. So you could just use a dichotomy and just ask people whether they agree or disagree, right? Agree, disagree. But this allows there to be some variation and allowing a person to indicate the degree to which they agree and the degree to which they don't agree. So people like it because it adds in some variability between people's responses. And they use this scale to allow people to indicate sort of how difficult or easy a question is to agree with. People that use dichotomous items like for the MMPI or other places like that, they don't do that. They actually use the question content itself to figure out if a question is sort of more difficult or less difficult, and they just give them 2 choices: either I agree or I don't agree. So there's lots of different ways of doing this, and I've had conversations with people that use these kinds of scales. I'm like, why don't you just ask them yes or no, or if they agree or disagree, and not do this? Like, well, how else are we able to tell people apart? I'm like, you tell them apart because you figure out the difficulty of the question, and if they answer, they agree to a difficult question that actually differentiates them from other people, to use the questions themselves, and it gets into a whole. People have a difficult time of thinking about questions in that way, but we'll talk more about that in a second. So you'll get some kind of instructions like rate the following statements, right? And then a bunch of statements, like if it was about trying to think, there was like there's a scale we used before. It was called like the neighborhood. Oh man, was it? I'm blanking out. It's like it's right there on the tip of my tongue. I had to do. It was called the subtle racism scale. This is actually, it's probably more relevant now than it ever has been, but this is 20 years ago or something like that. We were studying this scale called the subtle racism scale, where it was sort of moving away from this idea of sort of overt racism, where people like burning crosses and overt racism, to more subtle forms. So the questions were something like, it was this on these kind of scales, and it'd be like, I would be okay if a black family moved into my neighborhood. You have to, agree to disagree. I would be, I would share a meal with someone of a different race. Right? It was these weren't sort of crazy overt, but nowadays it doesn't even seem that subtle. Right? These are more what they considered at the time sort of more subtle forms of racism, and people would indicate their agreement to a bunch of these statements. And it's interesting that probably doesn't surprise you. Most of the responses, if you think about, this is like it was on a 7-point scale. They look like this. So if it was like that question about having a black neighbor move into your neighborhood, it looked like this. Everyone's like, they couldn't agree stronger. Like if I put 8 or 9 or whatever, they would just all move over there. It's the people down here that these kinds of questions started, really indicated that they had some racist tendencies. And we sort of discovered this too, that these were the sort of more overtly racist folks who were willing to say, no, I wouldn't be okay with a black person, black family moving in my neighborhood. They tend to be, on this end of the scale. But what really was going on was that the people here, it's possible that they actually wouldn't like this, but they had enough sense not to put that down on a scale, on a survey, because things were becoming much more, at that time, I think the term of like political correctness and things. So even if they felt uncomfortable about this, they would indicate that they agreed that they'd be comfortable with it. So it's an interesting mixture of all kinds of stuff, because we found using other things, like there's another scale called the IAT, which is called the Implicit Associations Task, that this would indicate people had racist or discriminatory tendencies, but yet when you ask them questions, they would put themselves here, even though their behaviors actually said something different. So people were just learning to sort of lie better, or at least put a more positive face when answering these kinds of questions. So sometimes asking a question that we thought at that point, again, it was these were sort of subtle forms of racism. They weren't that subtle. People figured it out and were able to answer accordingly in a more sort of politically correct, or what's the other one? Social. Oh man, I can't think of the word. Thank you. Socially desirable. Exactly right. They figured out a way to present themselves more socially desirable, in a more socially desirable way than they really believed. I don't know why I'm getting off on this tangent, but it does get out in this idea that trying to assess things like this becomes complicated. People aren't stupid, and let me back up. People can be stupid, oftentimes when it comes to assessing, or reflecting who they are, they have a tough time really owning up to, really being introspective and seeing things. So they want to see themselves in a much more positive way. So they oftentimes will put that face forward. But when you take that away and you do something much more implicit, these are the ones where they'll show you like a picture and a word, and you have to sort of respond to it. And the words that have associations, you tend to respond to faster. So if they show people something that indicates some kind of stereotype or discriminatory practice, and you're able to respond to those items quicker because you have that association, then it indicates that there's at least these sort of racist or discriminatory beliefs that people hold that feed into here. This is also problematic too, because you'll find out that a white person may have shorter reaction times to things that are discriminatory towards African Americans, but African Americans also respond faster to those same things because they have internalized those. So it becomes a whole complicated thing. So this is not to get off on a tangent about how difficult or complicated measurement is, because it is, and that's why you tend to have to look at things in multiple ways. But yeah. So I get off on this tangent. So these choices, on these Likert scales get used quite a lot for all kinds of different reasons. Like right now, just working yesterday on putting together some descriptives of a program that just started yesterday. Like one of the scales is something called pluralistic orientation. So I love the sound of that. But it's like your views on working with people that are different than you, being open to new ideas and new perspectives, being able to work in groups where people are from different backgrounds. Like how open are you to those kinds of things? And they use the 5-point sort of Likert scale, where it'll say something like, I like working with people who are different than I am. And then they, would rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how much they agree. They get used so often. Again, I would say that the Likert scale is like the backbone of a lot of psychometric testing in social sciences. All right, questions about that? So I'll continue to go off on the tangent if I don't. So we're at this weird point in the summer session where I tend to be a little bit under rested. So I just had another class at CSUN just started last week, and so I had a class yesterday and then today. So it's a lot of doing these lectures like this, live, and then spending a lot of time, sort of hours afterwards, editing and then posting and rendering, and so it's like I'm not sleeping a whole lot because on top of all that stuff, I have to do the regular things that I do in the summer, like research and other stuff and grants and other things. So I'm like running on fumes. And when that happens, my ability to regulate my tendency to digress becomes less able to do so, I guess. But sometimes the digressions can be fun, I guess, but take us off track. Questions about that stuff before I ramble on anymore? All right, let's move on. I mentioned this a second ago, but here it is in the notes that even versus odd number of choices. By the way, did I post these? I don't think I did. All right, we'll fix that. I'll fix that right after class. Make sure that you have these. I meant to. I just forgot, I guess. So I'll post these slides up. So you got sort of even versus odd number of choices I mentioned before. Odd numbers allow people to be neutral. Even numbers sort of force them. Very, very popular, technically ordinal, but are often assumed continuous if 5 or more choices. This is an important thing that probably doesn't get enough attention, where we oftentimes will treat these sort of Likert items as continuous scales. So we asked one question, again, just yesterday. We asked the students in this program about their levels of stress. Like how, in the past, I don't know, I think it was like 2 months, how have you been able to deal with stress? How well have you been able to deal with stress? And it's just one question, and it had, I think, 5 choices from like not at all to like no problem, right? Everything's fine. And if we try to do anything with those, compare groups or look at how that predicts other items or how other things predict that item, we're essentially treating that one item as a continuous scale that really only goes from 1 to 5. So it's technically an ordinal scale, because all you really know is that if someone answers a 2, they agree more than someone who answers a 1, but it's not really interval, nor is it really ratio. There's not an anchor point or anything that makes it a true 0. So we oftentimes will treat these things as if they are interval, but they really aren't. And there's been a lot of testing in terms of like simulations and things to say, well, if you have at least, I think it actually, I'd say here, if 5 or more choices, I actually think the research showed that it has to have 7 or more choices, but I could be wrong. It's 5 doesn't sound right. I think it actually has to be 7. To function truly as a continuous scale, you should have at least 7 choices, like from 1 to 7, agree or disagree to agree. So, if we assume that it technically is sort of continuous, we can do all kinds of stuff with it. So for instance, if I want to factor analyze a bunch of questions that use a Likert scale, I technically should correct for the fact that they're ordinal and use a different approach, but people typically don't. They use just a regular factor analysis that assumes continuously scored items, because it computes Pearson correlations to do the factor analysis. And yet we do it anyway. We calculate means, we calculate all kinds of stuff using these Likert items, when really we probably shouldn't be, but we do it anyway. All right. So category formats, like Likert, but with many more categories, like a 10-point scale, or using just more choices. Best if used with anchors. So research supports the use of 7-point scales to 21-point scales to really get people to differ on their choices. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to whatever? People are used to that even in regular lay language. People say that, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like, so-and-so? Oh, like a 7. Even in terms of attractiveness, right? Oh, she's a 10, or he's a 10, or she's a 7, he's an 8, right? We tend to have a natural sort of understanding of this sort of 1 to 10 ranking of things. And there's sort of a category format that we're sort of used to. Anyway. It's not that different than Likert scales, they're just more. This one's interesting, and this one I like a lot because it does the same kind of thing that Likert items do, but it actually forms a continuous scale. So how does this work? So on a scale, you could ask somebody and you when you go to the doctor and you're asked, about pain or how poorly you feel or something like that, they'll have like these scales of like different faces. Have you ever seen those, like with like the sad face to the happy face? You gotta like sort of pick which one represents the way you're feeling today. Or on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is your pain? Right? So we're used to those things. We're used to being able to say, oh, my pain's like a 5 or whatever. And it's also relative because it's 5 today because yesterday was a 6 and I feel better or whatever. So you sort of rank your pain from 1 to 10. This does the same thing, where on this side, this little node here represents sort of no headache, and this on the other side is the worst headache you've ever had. And if you're coming in to see a doctor or whatever because you have a really bad headache or pain or something, or if you're creating a scale to measure sort of headaches, which by the way, there are tests that actually look at sort of headache and headache experiences. You simply would say, well, all right, if this is no headache at all to the worst headache I've ever had, I'm somewhere like, I don't know, somewhere like here. This is where I am right now. And then how do we use that? Well, it's not clear on the slide, but usually they'll be of a specific length. Most visual analog scales, I believe, are 10 centimeters. So on a paper or whatever, they'd be 10 centimeters long, and people will put a mark somewhere, and then the researcher then takes a ruler, measures from one end, to the point in which they made the mark, and then they can actually give a very specific it's 5 centimeters and 10 or whatever, 5 centimeters and 4 millimeters. They can actually get it down to a very precise measurement of where exactly they are, so they can actually track much more fine-grained sort of changes in things like headaches or agreement or whatever. So that's what a VAS is, what it usually is called, like referred to. VAS for Visual Analog Scale. And it's cool because it actually says right there, it's instead of being a visual, a digital scale where you have sort of just, which basically is what a Likert scale is. Likert scales are essentially digital scales, right? It goes from 1 to 2, 2 to 3. You don't know if someone maybe is a 1.5 or a 1 2/3 or whatever. You can't measure that. It's just basically going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. It's just whole numbers. Where this is an analog scale, because depending on your level of measurement and how fine-tuned you want to get into measuring the mark, you can actually measure this in millimeters or whatever you want. Get it down to a very fine-grained level of measurement, which makes it analog, because it is a continuously scored thing. There is some... So when you get into... like online research and stuff, this becomes a little bit tricky because it's kind of hard to do this digitally. So what they'll do instead, it's like the in-between, is they'll have a line just like this, same kind of thing, and then they'll have like a slider like this. It's usually anchored at one side or the other. Let's say it's anchored at 0, and then what you do is you take your mouse, grab it, and then slide it along the scale. And usually on this end, it'll tell you, like, all right, that you're at a 0 right now. And as you slide it over here, like in the middle someplace, it'll then tell you, okay, well, this is at a 50. And then you slide it more, it goes to 75, and then all the way up to 100. So it'll give like 100 slices on a slider, which is sort of like I don't know, it's an analogous form of a visual analog scale, using sort of just 100 slices that they're able to move and have it print out on a readout like this. So that gets used more and more often too. So also using research, there's, people can turn dials and knobs and all kinds of interactive sort of things. They'll make sort of machinery where they're able to say, like, level of pain, they got to turn a knob to indicate how bad they feel. Other analogs of things that people use all the time. There's this idea of time sampling is a weird one that I just mentioned here. But it's another way people do it, where they would actually pick a specific sort of time frame, and then either sort of video them or have someone sort of observe and look for sort of behaviors or other things that are going on within that time. So they sample time. So they can say, okay, of 24 hours of the day, we're going to randomly, let's say they're awake from 8 to 10. We're going to randomly choose, a 15-minute window throughout the day, and then go and sort of observe behavior to see if we're able to see the kinds of behaviors we're looking for. This is sort of, if you increase the amount of time in which this occurs, you start to get into something called, it used to be called like daily diary studies. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before, where people would be told at certain times to go and write down sort of how they felt in a diary, like literally in a written diary. And then it sort of progressed more where they would give everybody in the study like a pager. And then what they would do is, every random points during the day, they would get a page telling them to sort of go in and like log in how they felt in a program or something, so that they could be transmitted to the researchers. And now they have apps that do this, and it's now called something like, they had more, it's something like Ecological Momentary Assessment, I think. One of my students that was a master's student working with me went on and got a PhD from UC Merced, and is now in Pennsylvania. He's a health researcher, and they do a lot of these sort of ecological momentary assessments. The ecological part means that it's ecologically valid, meaning that it's the people who are outside in their real lives doing the things they normally do. So trying to assess them while they're doing that makes it more externally valid, more ecologically valid. It's really more reflective of real life. It's momentary because it literally they'll get a page or a notification on their phone to go in and do it. So it's from moment to moment. It's random. And then obviously it's an assessment. It's a way of assessing their moods, or assessing their health, or assessing all kinds of stuff. There was a point I don't know, a few years ago, where a group of us here at CSUN had this really, really cool idea that somebody else ended up doing first. That's why we ended up not doing it. But we were looking at something like suicide prevention. This idea that as a sort of generation shift from things like going face-to-face therapy to doing like teletherapy or online therapy, to now there's more and more sort of text-based sort of ways in which you can actually interact with therapists and things. At the point we were talking about this, there really wasn't that. There was no text lines. It was just sort of phone hotlines. So we thought about creating an ecological momentary assessment where, like an app that would every once in a while would pop up and ask you how you're feeling, and it was basically to create a baseline of sort of moods and things. And then if we actually saw markers where people were dipping into clinical levels of depression or other things, that it would automatically then connect them through the app to text a health professional that could then sort of intervene and sort of help them before they got to the point of suicide ideation or other things. And it was this really cool idea, we thought. And then we were writing the proposal and started looking into it and found out that there was another company that was already doing it. They were like farther ahead than us, so we sort of quit at that point, thinking that they were farther along, and they were like a tech company. They were much more, much better equipped to do it than we were. But it's a really cool idea, and I hope more stuff like that actually takes off. And a lot of places that do telehealth or have hotlines have sort of switched to also having text lines, which is I think a move in the right direction too, making themselves much more available for people when they need them, especially if they're more comfortable texting than they are sort of calling people on the phone. Questions about that stuff? All right. Has anybody ever participated in a daily diary or ecological momentary assessment kind of study? Well, you would know. I mean, you would sign up and they were like, "Oh yeah, we're going to contact you at random times during the day. We want you to respond to these questions every time you get a push notification on your phone or something." Yeah, I mean, it would be sort of obvious that you were involved in something like that. And what they're trying to get at is really looking at the realities of people's behaviors and reactions and changes in mood and all kinds of stuff, so they can figure out what the antecedents are for negative behaviors, and trying to get people to change their habits, and all kinds of things can be used for this sort of time sampling, these different methods for looking for behaviors and things that are occurring out in the real world as like a field study, but all through phones or computer apps or all that kind of stuff like that. All right. Now this gets cool. Checklists and Q sort. Have you ever heard of a Q sort before? Has anybody ever heard of a Q sort? So there's a few of them. There's like the California Q sort, the attachment Q sort that I can think of because I actually have those as examples. But let's talk about checklists first. So another thing that people do, and it may seem like there's a different format. It's really taking the same format we talked about before and just making it a little bit more accessible or easier to sort of respond to. So both used in qualitative research as well as quantitative research, so they get used in both of them. And it's just a different way of approaching how to assess people's moods or personality or all kinds of stuff. So with checklists, you present just a list of a bunch of adjectives, and you go through and you check off the ones that you feel or that you think apply to you. So or it could be for somebody else. You could be doing a checklist about your partner or a checklist about your child, right? So these are all the adjectives that apply to whoever the sort of target is. And then have a person choose to endorse or not each item. And then you can determine all kinds of things, perceptions and mood issues, personality, all kinds of stuff using these checklists. Now, it may seem, because I'm checking off things that apply to me, that it seems like, oh, this is a different way of approaching. But really, all you're doing is, if you're checking it, you're answering yes. If you don't check it, you're answering no. So they're really just a different form of sort of dichotomous item, at least in terms of how they apply. They look at which items you sort of endorse and which ones you don't, and they can look at those to see look for patterns of personalities and all kinds of other stuff. So there's all kinds of ones. So the adjective checklists have been used a bunch in psychometrics. Any list of adjectives that can be marked as applicable or not applicable. So again, they wouldn't tell you. They wouldn't be listed this way, where it's like, these are positive adjectives and those are negative ones. They would just be listed in a random order. And you would go through and say, okay, I feel, yeah, sure, I'm carefree, I checked out on I'm enthusiastic. Yeah, sure, I'm sad sometimes, self-absorbed, whatever, detached. And you go through and sort of mark off the adjectives that seem to apply to you or to the person you're trying to be, like your ideal self. Could be for another person. It could also, they do this in marketing. They wouldn't use these adjectives. But if you're trying to look at what a company's sort of image is, you may have people, say, when you think of Coca-Cola, what adjective do you think apply? And people will go through and mark off, again, not these, but different kinds of adjectives, that reflect the image that Coca-Cola or some other company would create. So this gets used in marketing and all kinds of stuff too, to figure out what is the image the company is putting out there, and then they can figure out how do they address it. Because if they're getting, I don't know, self-absorbed as an adjective, sort of with a lot of different people, or suspicious or something, then they may have to sort of work on that part of their image and sort of turn that around. So let's get used in lots of different ways. So when written with initial uppercase letters, like literally ACL, it's actually a very specific adjective checklist that has 300 adjectives. And you have to go through and check off or not all 300 of them. And it goes from absent-minded to zany. Zany is one of the adjectives. And selected by U.S. psychologist Harrison G. I think it's maybe Goff, I don't know. And in 1921, and introduced as a commercial test in 1952. So this test has been around since 1952. It still is used. You can, if you look up the ACL, the adjective checklist, you'll get taken to a website called like Mind Garden or something like that, where you can actually purchase the test for use to actually give it to people and actually have it scored. The test yields 24 different scores, including measures of personal adjustment, self-confidence, self-control. This is lability, not liability. It literally is lability, like how labile you are. How able you are to sort of change your mind or to change yourself to fit into different situations, how that you're actually like dough, you're labile that way. Okay. Are you ready for counseling? So this is something that a counselor may do before you start. Actually, most counselors will have you do a sort of a series of tests to figure out different things about you before you start counseling. This one actually gives you, like, are you actually ready to be counseled, to actually receive counseling from a counselor? You get some response styles, like are you... I think it's something like aggressive, or there's introvert, like those kinds of things. And then there's different kinds of personality issues and needs that people have, and things like achievement or dominance and endurance and all kinds of different stuff. So there's 24 different subscales in those 300 items that they've identified, and it's been used in pretty, regular circulation since 1952. I think it's probably been updated since then, I'm going to assume. Only because I think some of the language may have changed. Even using the term zany may be a little bit of a stretch for most people. I don't know if everyone knows what zany means anymore, but some of the language probably has become a little bit outdated. So I'm assuming that that some version of it's been used as an activity, but it's likely been updated for language and things like that. Even a lot of the commonly used questionnaires, I think even the Beck Depression Inventory went through a revision because it used terms like the confused people. One of them was like, I sometimes feel blue. And a lot of younger, recent generation of respondents to that didn't know what that meant, to feel blue. Like they thought like feeling like the color or something, and just, it was becoming sort of an outdated term. Anyway, questions about that? I was going to show it to you, but it's huge and it would take a long time to go through. But just imagine this, but 300 of them, and you go through and check them off, and they use it to sort of scale things. And then it's probably, even though we're talking about factor analysis as a way of sort of putting items together, there are other types of approaches. I think, and again, this is totally from memory and not anything that I can definitively tell you. I'm pretty sure it's something like a checklist. What they do for the 24 scores, they look at items and they are able to group items together based on something called cluster analysis, as opposed to factor analysis, which is a different way of sort of looking at how the way people respond to items sort of cluster together. So people that that answer these questions in this way have this type of personality, or have these issues with self-confidence, and they're able to sort of cluster folks together that way. So cluster analysis tends to cluster people, respondents, into groups, where factor analysis groups the items into groups. So they're different approaches, but similar idea. Questions about checklists? Has anybody ever done one of these kind of checklists before? And do you remember? I'll need to get out and take some tests. There's only like 1 million of them. If you go online, most social media sites, you can tell you all kinds of stuff. Answer these 10 questions. It will tell you which Hogwarts house you belong to and stuff like that. Which I'm pretty sure at the end it's just random anyway, but that's just my opinion. My daughter was like all happy. She took some online test. She's like, I got put into Hogwarts. I'm like, that's great. She's like, yeah, it's awesome. I'm like, take it again. She's like, what do you mean? I'm like, take it again, answer the same way. Took it again, answer the same way, and then she was a Hufflepuff. She's like, damn it. Anyway, so I don't know how reliable those Harry Potter tests are, but still. Okay. Next. So Q sorts, I think, are a really cool idea. This is a different way of sort of getting at the same thing that sort of Likert items do. It just really forces people to sort of make choices in a different way, and there's no fence sitting. It's a different approach to the sort of ranking different things in an order, as opposed to, because with something like a Likert scale, you can answer 7 to everything. Right? I strongly agree to everything you're asking me. With Q sorts, it's the same idea, but you only get so many 7s. You only get so many, 6s, 5, 4s. You actually are limited to the amount you can actually strongly agree or strongly disagree to certain things. You actually have to choose. You have limits. It gives you basically, bins in which you have to put things, and you only get to put so many of them into different bins. So I'll explain more in a second. But it was introduced by William Stevenson in 1935. So again, something else that's been around for a long time. This methodology. He came from physics, but also got a degree in psychology. I was a student of Charles Spearman, who we mentioned earlier on. Charles Spearman was, along with Pearson and Spearman were two of the sort of pioneers of correlation and stuff. So the goal here is to get a quantitative description of a person's perceptions of a concept, any concept. The process is to give somebody a pile of numbered cards and have them sort them into piles. Piles represent graded degrees of description, with most descriptive to least descriptive across the piles. Different cue sorts have different rules about how many cards you can put in each pile, but it does force you to rank order how you think things fit into those piles. All right, so what they look like, something like, sorry, the picture's coming, not yet. So it's also been used as a means of self-evaluation of clients' current status, meaning that in talking about moods and stuff, just like with the back depression inventory, you can ask, I sometimes feel sad, these different things. But if you actually put those emotions and make people rank order where I feel this emotion the most and these emotions the least, it actually has a different sort of use than just having them sort of, affirm each one, and they can just say yes to everything or no to everything. The cue sort consists of a number of cards, often as many as 40 or 50, even 100 items, which would be a crazy thing to try to do, but possible. Consisting of a single trait, a single belief, or a single behavior that's written on the card. The goal is to sort these cards into one of 5 columns, ranging from statements such as very much like me on one extreme to not at all like me on the other. There are typically a specific number of cards allowed for each column, forcing the client to balance the cards evenly. So on the 2 extremes, like very much like me and not at all like me, you're going to get the same number of cards you can put in there, and you actually have to balance off the traits in these cards that are the most like you and the least like you, with varying degrees of piles in the middle. So the examples are like the California cue sort and the attachment cue sort, which I'll show you here. So this is a general, I read the word rarely on the thing, is a general sort of look at what one might look like, where you're given a bunch of cards and you're, you can put 2 cards here that represent never and 2 cards that represent always, but then you get 5 cards that represent frequently and 5 that represent rarely, right? So you actually have to choose where each card goes, and as new cards come up and you're reading them, you may end up trading them out and resorting in different places, and which cards you choose and where you put them can tell you a lot about like a profile about the person's personality or their beliefs or their perceptions about whatever topic they're measuring at the time. The California cue sort is here, and it gives, so these are about like personality traits, and you have 5 cards that are the most uncharacteristic of you, 5 that are the most characteristic, and they sort of go in, sort of like a Likert scale, from 1 to 9, but you're forced with how many of them you can actually choose for each one of those categories. So you can't just mark all of them with 9s or all of them with 1s or be on the fence at 5 for every single item. You actually have to choose, and you have to sort, and you have to figure out where you want them to go. So let's look at the California cue sort here. So these are the piles, 5, 8, 12, 16, 18, 16, 12, 8, 5 on both sides. They go from 1, which I forgot already was like the least or most uncharacteristic, to the most characteristic. And you're given these 100 statements from: is critical, skeptical, not easily impressed, is a genuinely dependable and responsible person, has a wide range of interests, okay, is a talkative individual, behaves in a giving way towards others, is fastidious, favors conservative values in a variety of areas, appears to have a high degree of intellectual capacity. All right. Now NB, I forget what NB stands for. Say it again. Oh, it's like it's just a note. I was thinking it was referring to a characteristic or something. So it's just saying a note about this is that it could be superficiality or depth of interest is irrelevant here. It just has a wide range of interest, but how the depth doesn't matter. I gotcha. I was reading it as something else, like non-behavioral or something like that I thought would be like defined up here. But you're right. I think it's just saying it's just a note of each one. So it appears to have a high degree of intellectual capacity, and basically the note is whether actualized or not doesn't matter. Originality is not necessarily assumed, right? Is uncomfortable with uncertainty and complexities. Anxiety and tension find outlet in bodily symptoms. Right? So if you're a super anxious person, you may actually put that as sort of being characteristic, right? That you have a lot of panics or other things that affect you physiologically, and maybe something that ends up being part of what you put in there. So you can see, imagine how difficult this would be. You got to go through 100 things, and you got to put those 100 things into these 9 piles from the most uncharacteristic to the most characteristic, and then basically the one in the middle, this 18, is sort of like the catch-all for stuff that's really hard to decide. This is like the fence stuff that's sort of like, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. You might throw into that category there. But things on this side in the 16 are slightly more characteristic. Things on this side are slightly less characteristic, and you have to sort of go out from there. And you got to be able to sort all 100 of them into those piles. And then down here, it talks about like, Q category, most characteristic 5 items. So like, these are California Q sort of items falling in the highest 2 and lowest 2 categories for student G and student N. It just gives sort of descriptions of the different 2 different students with different different ways of sorting. Has a wide range of interests, has warmth, capacity, right? So these are different profiles of 2 different kinds of students with their 2 most highest and 2 least. The 2 most characteristic and 2 least characteristic, and how they sort of sorted them to give you an idea of the difference. That's when I post this up, it's linked. You'll be able to check it out a little more closely. But the idea is, how people sort this can tell you a lot about their personality and what things they tend to find more important or least important. I can tell you a lot about them. Questions about that? You should try it. So it's analyzed in a different way than say something like a Likert scale or that kind of thing. They literally will go and take when this is done. They probably have made this more electronic now, but the way it was done before is they would take the piles of cards and then start to look at, start to compare those cards with profiles of like norm samples they've seen before. So they would find similar profiles of other folks and compare them and see, well, that person had an anxiety disorder, or this person had, is super conservative or whatever, and they start to match up the profiles based on comparisons with other respondents to the scale. So it's less. That's why I said it's almost more qualitative and less quantitative as an approach. Let's go back. So again, 5, 8, 12, 16, 18, right? It's sort of this nice symmetric thing where you have to sort of balance out all those characteristics. It's similar. This is the attachment Q sort. It's less numbers of cards, but you only get 4 of the sort of least to most likely. You have to sort of sort these this way. These are a little bit different, so I wanted to show you this one too, where attachment Q sort version 3. So it gives you scenarios. Child readily shares with mother or lets her hold things as she's asked to. So we look up here as well for 3 reasons: to provide an economical methodology for further examining relationships between base behavior at home and strained situation classification. So I don't know if you ever, did anybody know what the strained situation is? No one knows that? Some developmental psych? Yeah, so it's exactly right. I'm just going to repeat what you said. So it's a laboratory setup, a process where they use this strange situation to classify kids' attachment styles. And it's called the strange situation because they would have it was always a mom and a kid come into the laboratory, and they at some point, the mom would leave. they would bring a stranger in, and they would see how the kid reacts. And then the mom would come back after a certain time, and again they would see how the kid reacted. If the kid, when the stranger comes in, the mom's gone. If the kid, cries out for their mom or tries to find their mom, and then when the mom comes back, the kid seeks the mom out and is comforted. They saw that as being a sort of a solid attachment style, that secure and insecure, and then avoidant. Right. So those are basically the original three. Probably the most important thing out of this whole thing is the original author. It's right here, Ainsworth. Her name was Mary Ainsworth. And I remember when I sat down in my first developmental psychology course at CSUN as an undergraduate, the instructor is like calling out people's names, like, oh, Ainsworth, any relation to Mary Ainsworth? I'm like, will it help my grade at all? Because if it is, sure. Not a whole lot of Ainsworths out there. So I'm probably related some way or another to this original researcher, even though I have no idea. But, okay, so they would basically watch interactions between mother and child, and then they would sort how the child then actually responded. So instead of just having those three, basically the two big categories, secure and insecure, they would have a much more fine-tuned sort of version of the attachment style by going through, there's a bunch of scenarios. These are a whole lot of them. And they would go through and sort all these different statements. Like when a child is in a happy mood, he's likely to stay that way all day. Right, so this could be having the parent go through and do this about the child. Child enjoys climbing all over mother when they play. Right, child is easily upset when mother makes him change from one activity to another. Right, so these are just a way of using all these statements. There's a whole bunch of them to then look at the attachment style of a child in a Q-sort form. Right. And so as you're looking at interactions between the mother and child, or having a mother respond about the child, or have somebody, a teacher respond about the child, or whatever it is, they would then go through and have to put all those different scenarios into these different piles to show. And usually it's the top, or maybe the top two and the bottom two that are the most sort of informative about either like with the Q sort, the person's personality or something, or the attachment style, where the stuff in the middle becomes less important because they're not as characteristic or uncharacteristic of the person. So it's just a way of being able to rank and rate different qualities of different sorts in a way that forces you to choose which things are most important, which things are the least important, and everything else in the middle sort of just washes out.